Hey, buddy, come here, man. Come here. Hey, you want some splines, man? Check it out. I got X rotation, Y rotation, Z translation. I even got some foot roll if you like that kind of stuff. Can I hook you up, buddy? Oh, what? You don't like splines? Oh, it's just because you don't know how to use them, man. Hey, come on. I'll show you the good stuff. And the first one's free. Come on. In here, man. Don't be scared. Come on. Go. Hi, my name is Victor Navone, and I'm an animator for Pixar Animation Studios. I've been there for 7 years, and I've worked on every feature film since Monsters Incorporated. I never intended to be a professional animator. I have a degree in fine arts, and I started out work as a concept designer and CG artist for a small game company. I started teaching myself animation on my spare time, and one of my first animation tests, called Alien Song, got the attention of Pixar. They called me for an interview, and I've been there ever since. Today, I'm going to talk to you about one of the more misunderstood animation tools, splines. Come with me, won't you? So let's talk about splines. I love splines. I practically live in the graph editor, and sometimes I'll even animate my characters right in the graph editor without actually touching the models. Now, a lot of animators I know are intimidated, if not terrified, of the spline editor. And who can blame them? Sometimes you open this thing up and it looks like the back of your grandma's legs. But if you understand a few key concepts about the graph editor and splines, you can harness their awesome power and use them to control and polish your animation. I personally love working in splines. I do most of my work in the spline editor. I find that just by knowing what a spline should look like, I can diagnose a lot of problems in my timing and my spacing, and I can also get a good head start on my polishing phase right at the beginning. These are not hard, fast rules that I'm imparting to you here. These are all just guidelines that are based on my observations from my experience in the animation world. Everybody works differently. This is not the only valid way of working. There are lots of different ways to animate. But this is what I've found to be the most intuitive and logical and economical way to work. I'll be using Maya's graph editor to illustrate all my examples today, but the principles that I'll be discussing really apply to any spline editor in any modern 3D animation program. Now, before I get into the actual animation part, I'd like to go over some basic settings in Maya that will make your experience in the spline editor easier. The first thing I want to do is open up the preferences for animation. Settings and preferences, preferences, settings, animation. In the animation preferences, I make sure that my weighted tangents are turned on, and then my default in and out tangents are set to spline. Flat is also a good option, but I prefer to work in spline. I would recommend against working with clamped or plateau for reasons I'll talk about later. Within the graph editor itself, there are also some preferences I like to set. Again, under curves, I make sure that I have weighted tangents here. Let me just show you why that is, because if I have them set to non-weighted tangents and I zoom in and out, you can see the spline handles stay the same length the whole time, which I find to be a completely useless feature. I'm not even really sure why that's there. So let's just avoid that completely and make sure that our splines are set to weighted tangents, and now they are absolute to the curves. Also, I tell it to always show my tangents. I'll go here to View, Tangents, Always, just because I always like to see what my tangents are doing without having to select a key to bring it up. Now I'm going to start with a basic explanation of the graph editor. This is going to be some very rudimentary stuff for those of you who are already familiar with it, but I want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody behind, and I want to get very clear on these concepts before we move ahead. So I'm going to start with a simple animation of a ball moving from one position to another position, or we'll call them pose A and pose B. So here is pose A on the left, and then pose B is on the right. Now I've selected the ball, and you can see here in the graph editor are all the animation channels. I'm just going to select Translate X here because Translate X is the only one that's actually animated. So you can see that's isolated the X translation spline in the graph editor here. Now, what is this telling us right off the bat? Well, I can tell a couple things right away. That my holds are right here on either side, because you can see the spline is flat there. Whenever the spline is flat, that means there's no movement. It's a hold. And whenever the spline has a slope to it, that means there's movement to it. The steeper the slope, the faster the movement. And as the slope starts to flatten out, the object decelerates or accelerates. Now you'll notice that I actually have 4 keys in here. I have a key on frame 1, frame 7, frame 24, and frame 30. That's because I've actually keyed these holds for reasons that I'll get into shortly. But basically, I just want to reiterate that when the spline is flat, the object's in a hold, and when the spline is curved, the object is moving. As far as the numbers in the graph editor, what do those mean? Well, from left to right, we have time in frames, starting with frame 0 or 1 over here on the left, moving all the way to frame 30. And the vertical axis is the value. That can be the value in centimeters or degrees of rotation or a percentage, whatever that channel is set up to use. Basically, this graph is showing me how and when my object is moving over time. So as the time slider moves from left to right, the value of that object, in this case X translation, is represented here on the graph. So the black dots on the spline here represent the keys that I've set. And again, I've set 4 keys on frame 1, 7, 24, and 30. And the red line passing through them, well, that's the spline. That is the computer doing the in-betweens to tell me what happens in between those keys. Now, most of the time, the computer is a lousy in-betweener, which is why we need to take control of the graph editor to improve our timing. Now, don't expect the shape of the spline in the graph editor to look like how your object is moving in the camera. Sometimes it will, coincidentally. For example, if you've loaded in the Y translation of a bouncing ball into your graph editor, the shape of that spline might actually look like the shape of your ball bouncing in the camera. But for the most part, the shape of the spline has nothing to do with the path of action of the object in your camera. It's more telling you about when your object is stopping and starting and the quality of that motion. What we can tell about the path of our objects from looking at the spline editor is when the object is changing direction. So right now, because the spline is only traveling upward in one direction, it's only traveling in one direction in the camera. But if the spline were to change direction, like so, then I know that the object would actually be reversing at some point in the animation. Upon closer inspection of the graph editor, you may notice these little buttons along the top here for selecting different types of splines. I just want to talk about those briefly, and for this I've just created a pretty random spline to show you the effects of these different types. So I'll select these all. Usually when I'm coming out of blocking, I will put them in flat tangents. That's the default for me, so you can see each key as the spline passes through it, the tangent is flat, and I can smooth those out later manually as I see fit. If I were to put these as the default spline tangents like this, you can see my spline is nice and smooth, but it's doing some things that I don't like. For instance, right around here, you can see that this spline is actually moving beyond that key, which is not what I want. I want to keep the spline within the range of the keys that I've set myself. So I don't recommend using the regular spline tangents right off the bat. I'll save those for later. If you use clamped tangents or these plateau tangents, I don't like those either because the tangents will start to move on their own as I move the keys around. So if you see right there, the tangents are popping into new shapes. I don't want to let the computer do any of my tangent rotation. I want to do that all myself, and I don't want any surprises when I'm moving keys around. So I don't recommend using plateau or clamped. Let's see what else we got. We've got linear, which I don't use very often, maybe for a fast in or fast out. I'll talk about that more later. And then, of course, there's stepped mode here, which you may use in your blocking phase, and that's fine because there are no in-betweens in this case. But what I usually go for is the default of flat tangents, like so. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about tangent handles, which are these brown things that you see right here. The tangent handles are what give the splines the ability to smooth out the timing and the spacing of your animation. So as you can see, these tangent handles are causing the curve to accelerate and decelerate into the keys, allowing me to get ease-ins and ease-outs, or slow-ins and slow-outs. And that's where the real power of the graph editor lies. The tangent handles really allow you to take advantage of what the computer does best, and that is smooth in-betweens. Now that we've discussed the basic concepts of the graph editor, let's start to talk about timing in animation and what the various principles of timing look like in the graph editor. Now, every time you move an object, you need to make a decision about the timing of that object. How is it going to move? Is it going to ease in or ease out of the last pose? Is it going to overshoot? Is it going to anticipate or fast in? You need to make these decisions every time something moves. Otherwise, you're letting the computer make that decision, and the computer very rarely comes up with an interesting solution. Now, when I come out of blocking, I set all my tangents to flat tangents, just like you see here. But I rarely leave them all that way. Otherwise, my timing and spacing would be even and boring. So if I play this back here, you can see that the movement on the ball is not very interesting. It basically starts and stops moving in the same way. And if I use the nifty arc tracker to show the spacing, you can see that the dots are very evenly spaced apart through here. There's a little bit of acceleration and deceleration at the end, but not much. And also you can see that my timing and my spacing are symmetrical. Just like you try to avoid twinning or symmetry in your poses, you also want to avoid symmetry in your timing. So you can see here in the graph editor that the spline, the X-translation spline, looks symmetrical. It's coming out of pose A the same way that it's going in to pose B. So this is where timing comes into play. While I will be discussing the editing of splines to achieve different types of timing in your animation, that's not to say that I advocate doing all of your timing exclusively in the graph editor. You should be building in your eases and your anticipations and your overshoots into your blocking phase and your poses and breakdowns. The techniques I'm going to be showing you here are really to help you identify the timing that's already in your blocking, to push it further, and to polish it, and maybe to add a little bit more if there's some details that you left out of your blocking.
Animation Mentor.
The first kind of timing I'm going to talk about is the ease in, probably the most common timing solution and what you'll be using the most. Now, one really easy way to get an ease in is just to select the first key of the hold and move it down slightly, and then tilt the tangent handle so that it flows through. So now that you can see that rather than coming to the third key and holding, you can see it keeps continuing just a little bit on a really shallow curve until it hits the fourth key. Now, if you'll remember back to what I was talking about earlier on, anytime the keys are flat, anytime there's a plateau, that means there's no movement in the object. Anytime there's a slope, that means the object is moving. So as the slope flattens and becomes a plateau, that means you've got deceleration or an ease in. So how do I know how much to drop and tilt this third key here into the ease in? Well, like most things in animation, that will come with experience. But there are a lot of factors that go into determining that. How heavy is the object? How fast is it moving? What style of animation are you animating? A good rule of thumb for starting to place that key would be to take the difference between the first pose and the last pose and drop this key to about somewhere between 85 and 95% of that distance as a good starting point. Let me go ahead and re-record the arc tracking for that so you can see how the spacing changes with that ease in. All right. Here you can see now that there are more dots on the right side of the screen than there are on the left. That means that the ball is favoring that second pose as it eases in. So if your mentor ever asks you to favor a pose, they generally mean to ease into that pose or spend more time towards that pose than towards the previous pose. And now you can see my spacing is asymmetrical, just like the timing, because the spline is now asymmetrical. It's not entering the second pose the way it's leaving the first pose. So getting back to knowing how much to drop and tilt this spline, I usually do between 85 and 95% of the difference between the first pose and the second pose. And as far as tilting the tangent handle, let me go ahead and zoom in here. Basically, I want to tilt this tangent handle so that it creates a nice flow through the key into the next key. If I were to leave it flat like this, then there would be a deceleration here, and then an acceleration, and then another deceleration there, which would mess with my timing. So basically, I just want to make sure that the spline moves nicely through that key. And I want to make sure that I don't tilt it so far that the spline actually goes beyond the second key. As you can see right here, it actually goes slightly beyond that second key before coming back, because that gives you a change of direction in the spline, which means a change of direction in the movement, and that's not what you want here. This would actually be an overshoot rather than ease in. So you don't want to do that, and I will talk more about spline handles in my spline hygiene talk in part 2 of this lecture. But for now, just remember to keep the nice flow going through that spline. All right, let's talk about an ease out now. It's basically the same thing. You're just doing it to the first pose instead of the second pose. So I will take the second key here, which is the end of the hold of the first pose, and I will move it up slightly and tilt the handle accordingly to get a nice flow through that key. And let's go ahead and check out the spacing on that. Okay. Now you can see that the ball is accelerating out of that first move, and that the dots are more clumped over here on the left than they are on the right, so now we're favoring the first pose. And again, the timing and the spacing are asymmetrical. Now there's more than one way to add an ease in, of course. I could also select this tangent handle here, free up the weighting, and then pull it out longer, so that we get a steeper slope on the left side here and then a more gradual deceleration into the second pose. We could also do it by adding another key right here and pulling that up to create an ease in like so. Basically anything that you can do to cause the curve to be shallower on one side than on the other is going to give you an ease in that direction. But for now I'm just going to keep it simple and not add any extra keys. The next type of timing I'd like to talk about is fast ins and fast outs. For this, I don't actually need to adjust the value of any of my keys. I can do it just by playing with the tangent handles and the tangent types. Now, usually you will use a fast in or a fast out when your object is being acted on by an external force, say a baseball being hit by a bat or something colliding with a wall. When you do a fast in or a fast out, that means you're either getting a zero acceleration or zero deceleration, something stopping or starting very abruptly. Let's start by doing a fast in into this second pose here. So I'm going to select this third key right here, and an easy way to get a fast in is just convert that to a linear key. And you can see right now it's basically easing out of this hold right here, and then it's accelerating, and while the key is still sloped, boom, it stops and goes flat. So that means the ball is going to stop abruptly. I'm actually going to go ahead and break this tangent with this button right here so I can pull this down a little bit further and get a little bit steeper slope right there, so it's going a little bit faster before it stops, so you can really see this example. And I'm going to use the arc tracker tool to show you the spacing. There we go. All right, if I play this back now, you can see it's going along and boom, it stops on a dime. That's because it's doing a fast in to that second pose. And if we look at the spacing, you can see the dots are gradually getting further and further apart until they stop altogether. So there is no deceleration into this. One time in particular that I end up using a fast in is like when a foot plants on the ground, because there's nothing to stop the foot from moving until it actually impacts the ground, so it gives it a nice sense of weight. I can get a similar effect by freeing the weight on this tangent handle, so I can go to key, free tangent weight, and you can see now the tangent handle has a little open box in there, and I can just shorten this way down. And that'll give me a similar effect if you don't want to go into linear keys at this point. So that's a fast in to the second pose. Let's look at a fast out of the first pose. Let's go ahead and convert that to linear, like so. Now if I play it back, you see the ball starts moving abruptly as if it's been hit by something, and then it decelerates to a stop. And I can even go so far as to combine this with more of an ease in by dropping the second one down here, and tilting the handle like so. Now I'll get an even more gradual deceleration to give the ball more of a sense of weight. Again, just to look at the shape of the spline, right here we have a plateau, there's no movement. Suddenly there's a slope, so we've got an abrupt movement, and then the slope gets gradually more and more shallow until, once again, it's flat at the end and the ball has stopped again. Now I'm going to show you how you can get a really basic form of overshoot right in the Spline editor. Again, I don't advocate doing all your overshoots this way, but this is a really neat and easy little trick for getting a form of that kind of overlap. Remember that anytime the spline changes direction, the object changes direction too. So to get a simple form of overshoot, I'm just going to select this third key, and instead of moving it down, I'm actually going to move it up past the final resting key, so that now the ball is going to go beyond that key and then settle back. So if I play this, you see I got a little simple overshoot and settle at the end there. And you could just adjust the value of this third key to taste. So I think that one might be a little bit further than I want. Let's pull it back a little bit. Yeah, that looks better to me. And I could do the same thing on the other side to give the ball a little bit of anticipation. Let's just undo that. And I'll go over here to the second key, and I will pull this one down again so that there's a change in direction around frame 7. So the ball will back up a little bit before it starts to move. If I play that, now you can see that the ball seems to anticipate in the opposite direction before moving towards its second pose. Anticipation and overshoot are really good for giving your objects a sense of life or a sense of self-motivation and resiliency. Now I could get a similar effect without moving the keys, just by tilting the spline handles like so that the spline actually overshoots the keys, but the keys remain in place. I prefer not to do this for reasons that I will discuss in my spline hygiene section in part 2. Suffice to say, I like to have a key to lock down any overshoot or any anticipation I have. That way I don't have to worry about this curve getting lost later on if I'm adjusting timing. Again, I could also create anticipations and overshoots by adding more keys or moving these keys around in time. But for now, I want to focus on just the value and the tangents of the keys that we already have from our blocking. Now that I've covered some of the basic timing solutions in the graph editor, I am going to mix and match various solutions and create some animation on the fly right in the graph editor. So I'm just going to start with a pose A and a pose B. I'm going to actually delete these keys in the middle here. So now I just have an animation of the ball going from one position to the next position here. And let's see, I'll just go ahead and invent a little scenario here. I'm going to start with the ball with a little bit of a hold. Let's say have it hold until about frame 4. Let's just go ahead and copy and paste that right there. Set that to a flat tangent. Okay, so I've got a hold there. And then I want it to, actually let's move it up a little bit so it's a little further in frame there. So I start right about there. And now I want it to anticipate back a little bit. So I'll just frame forward a little bit. Let's say right about there. And I'll go ahead and add a key. And just have it anticipate back like so. And let me just flatten out that tangent. And I'm going to copy paste that. Paste it right there. Okay, so now I've got another little hold, so he's anticipating back into a hold, and then I'm going to have him launch forward pretty quickly and have him bounce off an invisible object like he's colliding with a wall. So I'm going to, I'll say I'll have him hit right about frame 18. I'm just going to go ahead and add a key here where he hits the wall right about here. Now let's make that a value of even 10. Okay, And since that's going to be a fast in because he's colliding with a solid object, I'll just make that a linear key for now. And let's see, I'm going to have him bounce off that wall a couple times, so go ahead and add a couple more keys here for the bounce. Let me just zoom into that bounce. So I see that each time a spline changes direction, he's changing direction. So it's going to be like he's bouncing off a solid object that is at an x value of 10 right here. There's probably a more efficient way to do what I'm doing with these copy-pasting keys, but I'm not a Maya expert. So I'm just going to make these linear tangents so he's bouncing off the wall with fast ins and out each time, just like your bouncing ball exercises. I'll go ahead and flatten these tangents right here, and I'm actually going to widen them a little bit so that it favors the pose away from the wall a little bit. Let's just set those to free weights, select all the tangents, and pull them a little bit wider, just to broaden that arc a little bit. And what else? I think this is a little bit far for that tangent to be out. Let's just pull that back in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to break these fast ends here so I can get some steeper curves on them. Just break those tangents. There we go. And let's see. I think I'm going to have him ease into this anticipation pose right here. So let me just zoom into that. And I'm just going to take this third key here and move it up and tilt it a little bit so that he's easing into that fourth key right there, but not overshooting it. And, well, let's take a look and see how it looks. Okay, so, it's not going to win an Annie or anything, but it's pretty easy to do just right here in the graph editor. So just to review what I've done, let me just go full screen on this guy right here. Starting off here with a hold where there's no movement because the tangents are flat and the spline is flat in between the keys. Then anticipating backward away from the final pose, which is over here, so we're moving away from that final pose. Anticipating in the opposite direction, and we're actually easing into that anticipation because I've got a tilted tangent here. So here's the anticipation pose right here, and then we're accelerating towards the invisible wall, so you can see the spline is at its steepest right before this key right here. So the ball is constantly accelerating until it hits that wall, and then it bounces immediately off. You can see I get a fast out there too, so it's really popping off that wall quickly, and then changing direction and bouncing off again, changing direction, bouncing off again. And I can tell by looking at these splines right here that each successive bounce is a little smaller because each one of these arcs right here is a little bit smaller. And I can tell that these bounces are smaller than the original anticipation and action across the frame. So that's just a quick and dirty example of how you can do some animation right in the graph editor, all based on the principles that I've been talking about here. Eases, fast ins, fast outs, overshoots, etc. Now, you probably noticed in this example that I did a lot of custom work on these tangents to get them to do exactly what I want them to do. Unfortunately, Maya makes you jump through a lot of hoops to get exactly the right shape of the tangents that you want, but don't let that stop you. You should be able to put these tangents at whatever angle and whatever length you want. So that may mean selecting the key, breaking the tangent, selecting the tangent, freeing the weight so that you can pull it as far as you want, and now I can move this tangent independently and get whatever shape I like. And sometimes you will have to do this to get the exact curve that you want, so don't let Maya stop you. Now, obviously, I didn't really plan this animation out very much or do thumbnails or video reference or anything like that, but I did have an idea in my head of what kind of timing I wanted. I knew I wanted a hold, I knew I wanted an ease into the anticipation pose, I knew I wanted fast ins and outs off this wall. So knowing that, I was able to anticipate what kinds of spline shapes I would need, how to pull the tangent lengths, how to get the acceleration and deceleration I wanted to. So, for example, if I kept the keys the same and just let the computer do all the in-betweening by, say, converting these all just to the generic spline tangents, then I would get something like this. You can see the movement across the frame is very even, and it looks more wobbly at the end. You don't really feel that impact as much. So, not the effect that I wanted. And I could also change these to flat tangents. And now you can feel that the impact over here is softer. You don't really feel it bouncing off that hard surface. So this concludes part 1 of my spline lecture, and hopefully the techniques I've outlined here will help you to get better timing in your splines and in your animation. In part 2, I'll be talking about things like spline hygiene, some tips and tricks and shortcuts, and I'll be going through a spline-based workflow to help you get from blocking into rough animation. See you then! Hi, I'm Victor Navone, animator for Pixar. Today I'm back once again to talk about splines. This will be part 2 of my spline lecture. Today I will cover such topics as spline hygiene, tips and tricks, and spline-based workflow. Follow these guidelines and your splines won't end up looking like this. Today I'm going to talk to you about something that's a little bit delicate, maybe hard for some of you to listen to, but it's important that somebody told you about this sooner or later. I'm going to be talking to you about spline hygiene. It's very important to have clean splines, I feel. Clean splines beget clean animation, smooth arcs, nice timing, all that good stuff. Occasionally, I open up a student's file in Maya or even a coworker's file if I have to do a fix at work, and it will become immediately obvious to me who has cleaned up their splines and who hasn't been to the graph editor in a while to see what's going on in there. I might see keys that are left in linear mode. I might see tangent handles that are shooting off to who knows where. I might see lots of redundant keyframes added on ones where they didn't need to be there, or I might even see animation that's been done on different controls to counter-animate controls just because the animator wasn't aware that he had set keys in certain places, and so he was trying to compensate in other areas of the animation. So I think it's always a good idea to at least do one smoothing pass, one cleanup pass on all your splines as you're coming out of blocking and going into polish, just to keep things clean. It'll make your animation easier to edit later on. It'll allow you to diagnose a lot of problems in your spacing, your arcs, and your timing, and it's really just good manners. So let's talk about some principles of spline hygiene and how they apply to you. Not that your splines aren't clean, but how they apply to other people, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a few splines in the old graph editor and see what kind of problems we find and how to fix them. Just let me back up a little bit and say that these principles are certainly not set in stone. These are all just things that I've come up with on my own that help me to diagnose and fix problems in my own animation, or things that I can do preventatively to hopefully preclude problems in my animation later on. This is not the Bible. These are just some observations that I've made, and I apply to my own work, and it seems to work. So here we go. The first principle I'm going to talk about is spline smoothness. You may take it for granted that a spline is going to be smooth, because after all, what is a spline but a smooth line drawn between your keyframes? Well, that's not necessarily something you can count on, because depending on what your tangent handles are doing or what adjacent keys are doing, your splines may not be smooth. And usually if you want a smooth action or a nice smooth arc or a smooth piece of timing, you're probably going to want a smooth spline as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in right here, and I can see right here on this line going down right here that I've got a bunch of extra tangent handles kind of pulled off. These tangent handles aren't really aligned with the spline, so it's probably going to give me a little bit of hitchiness in that motion. So if I were just to come in here and tilt these handles so that they follow the overall direction of the spline, and really basically adjusting the tangents so that they point to their neighboring keyframes, I find that that will, a lot of the time, give me a lot smoother motion than just leaving those in there. Otherwise, I might have to go in and add more keys in between just to smooth out that spline. Where else? Like, for instance, right here, you can see as this red spline, now it's red, now I select it, it goes white. The X-translate, as this comes up, you can see that this handle right here is a little bit flat rather than allowing the spline to flow continuously through the key. Now, if I wanted the animation to slow down a little bit right there, that would be fine, because you remember, as a tangent gets flatter, that means the movement gets slower. But in this case, I actually want the movement to flow through that spline, so I'm just going to go ahead and smooth out that tangent. So now I've got a nice continuation of this curve going through here. So if I want smooth motion, generally I'll do a first pass on here while I go through and I look for any tangent handles that aren't really tangential to the spline that's running through them, and just try to smooth those out by eye. You can see right here I have a bunch of keys that are on ones, frames 9, 10, 11, and 12. And I will actually go in and smooth these tangents as well. Now you might think that if the keys are all on ones, well then every frame is being controlled by a key, so what do I really care what the tangents are doing in between? Well, there's a couple reasons to go ahead and smooth these out anyway. One is motion blur. Motion blur actually does calculate what goes on in between every frame. So how you have your tangent handles adjusted in between those keys can affect the quality of the motion blur for better or worse. The second reason to smooth out tangent handles on keys that are on ones would be that if later on, if you need to scale that animation, let's say stretch it out and make it longer, as the keys spread apart, the tangent handles will basically do the right thing, and they will keep that spline smooth as your animation extends out in time. So it's just a good bit of prophylactic smoothing there. Now, for every guideline I'm going to present you here, there is a caveat or an exception. Like I said, none of this is set in stone. For example, if you want your animation to have a little bit of noise to it or a little bit of jitter to it, then it's perfectly fine to have tangents that don't necessarily respect the curve of the spline, just to break things up a little bit, if that's what you're going for. If not, I would suggest doing a smoothing pass. You can always go back in later and maybe tweak the tangent handles or add more keys and then add a little noise to your animation if you want to. For example, if you have a character like an old lady who has a little bit of tremble to her, like a little bit of palsy, and you want, when she's reaching for something, you want to have a little bit of shake in the hand, just simply adding some extra breakdowns in the reach and then tilting those tangent handles at odd angles might add a little bit of noise to your animation that will help to sell the frailty of that character. Curve containment. What do I mean by curve containment? I mean not allowing the spline to go beyond its neighboring keys. Really, you want your keys to define the extremes of your motion, not the splines, because the keys are absolute and they stay where they are until you move them, but the in-betweens of the splines are relative to what the keys are doing. So, for example, let's just zoom in right here, and you see on my X-translate spline right here, this tangent handle is tilted in such a way that the spline curves beyond where the key was, so it's actually even going further in value than this key right here. Now, it may look fine on playback, and when you play blast, it'll probably look fine. The only problem is if I start moving keys around over here, it's going to change the angle. If I select this key here and I move it back in time towards the previous key, you can see, well, now I've lost that extreme where that was. That means if you need to retime your animation, you might lose some of your extremes if you don't have them locked down with keys. So if you run into a situation like this where you have the tangent handle tilted as such and you have some curves going beyond the keys and you like what it does, and then just go ahead and add a key there just to protect that extreme. So I'll do that right here, and boom, now I got a key there, and now I know that extreme is not going to change even if I need to retime my animation. So, of course, an exception to that would be, let's say you're in a hurry and you need to do some overlap on some fingers or on some eyelids or something. It's a really cheap and easy way to get a little bit of overshoot on a key if you just take the handle and tilt it up just a little bit, so let it overshoot. So, for example, if I want this to overshoot a little bit more right there, I'll just tilt that handle up and let it go, and then it travels back down to the next key. So that's something I might do late in my polish phase when I know I'm not going to be retiming anything. I don't really feel like adding another key there. I just want a really quick little bit of overshoot. Another reason to do it might be if you want your extreme to happen on a half frame. Now, that might sound kind of crazy, but believe it or not, there are times when you need to time something to a specific length, and 3 frames is too short and 4 frames is too long. You want that extreme to hit on frame 3.5. When you get into really minute actions or fast motions, sometimes that happens. So oftentimes I will actually go in and tilt my tangent handle so that the extreme happens right here in between those 2 frames. This is more the kind of detail you'll probably get into if you're working on feature films or something that's going to be played back on a big screen where you really see all the little details and tiny nuances of timing. So just to recap that, curve containment means you want to keep the value of the spline within the range of the keys. So in this case, I would just go ahead and flatten out this key right here if I want this to be my extreme. Now, just as you don't want to overshoot neighboring keys in value, you also don't want to overshoot them in time. So you want to look for places where your tangent handles might be extending beyond the next keyframe in time. For example, right here on this extreme keyframe right here, you can see the tangent is actually going beyond the next keyframe there. And what it's doing, if we just zoom in right here, as you can see, it's creating a little bit of a hitch in the spline there, or a little cliff. And that's probably going to result in a hitch in my animation. So I'll just take this tangent here and just drag it back in time so that it doesn't overlap the next keyframe, and so it doesn't overlap the next tangent handle either. Just allow those a little bit of elbow room and smooth out the spline as so. Next, I'm going to talk about economy of keys. Now, a lot of people say that the computer is a lousy in-betweener, and that's both true and false. It's lousy in that the computer does not make creative or informed choices, but it's great in the fact that it makes perfect mathematical choices and allows you to smooth your animation easily. So in this respect, I think it's important to have an economy of keys. If we look at this spline right here, you can see there are lots of keys on 1s and 2s on what basically wants to be one smooth spline right here. So the addition of all these extra keys in here is kind of causing the spline to get a little bit lumpy through there. And in this case, if I just go through here and delete some of these keys, I can let the spline's natural smoothing tendencies take over, and I'll just end up with a prettier looking spline here. Like so. I can even go in here and hit the smooth spline button. Well, I guess they were already pretty smooth. Okay, yeah, so just not using more keys than you have to. Let the computer do its job. It's a dumb job, but it's good at it. The exception to this might be if you have an action that needs to be very precise. For example, if you need to match move or counter animate an object so that it remains touching another object, but you're not using a constraint to attach those two things. So you need to actually go in and set keys on 1s and 2s to make sure that those two objects don't interpenetrate. Or again, if you want some kind of rough motion, like a character who's shaky or something that's jiggling, you want to have the extra keys in there to actually rough up the spline and not have it be a smooth motion. Those are times when economy of keys is not so important. But when I can, I like to try to delete some of the extraneous keys in between so that it's easier to manage my animation, it's easier to retime it if I want to, and easier to keep it clean and smooth. The last principle I will talk about is variation. Now, just like in your animation performance, you want to avoid repetitive actions, you want to avoid symmetrical timing, symmetrical poses. You want to break things up a little bit. So you want to avoid patterns and repetition that can become boring. So for example, I'll zoom in right here. You can see I have this section right here where the upper extreme keys are all about the same value, same with these lower two, and they're all happening at the same interval. I think they're all about 3 frames apart here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, yeah. These keys are all about 3 frames apart, and they're all about the same opposing values. So that's going to give you a movement that's also very repetitive and uninteresting to look at. You can also see that these tangent handles here are all pretty symmetrical. They're all flat and about the same length on either side. So there's some quick, simple things you can do to break this up a little bit and make the resulting animation a little more interesting. You can just alter the values a little bit, just to make some a little lower and some a little higher. You can pull tangent handles out on one side so that the timing is favoring one key over another. I'm actually having to break the tangent handles here to do this. So if you remember how I talked about in the first spline lecture about not having symmetrical timing, this is a really simple way just to add a little bit of ease out or a little bit of ease in to an action just by pulling the tangent handle on one side of that action out. So now you can see we're slowing out of this action a little bit more and a little bit faster into the next key. So that's going to break up the timing a little bit, and I've also modified the values, the difference in values, to break up the values a little bit. If I wanted to take it further, I could even go in and offset these keys by a frame. So now we're offsetting the timing even further. But this class is really more about playing with tangents and keys and not so much about moving them in time. So those are some ways to avoid repetition in your splines, which will hopefully result in less repetition in your performance. There's definitely an art to splining, as with every other aspect of animation. And knowing when to pull a tangent handle or when to add an extra key, when to smooth something, when to leave it rough, these are all things that will come with experience. So just try to learn the guidelines, try to apply them, see when they work, when they don't, and hopefully with experience, you too will become a true spline connoisseur. It is possible to take these guidelines too far. You can over-smooth your splines, and this is something else that I see in student work and sometimes in professional work, is people who have smoothed their splines so much to the point where there's no more texture or no more accent or emphasis in them. So you do need to be aware of where your extremes are and not, for example, easing in so much that you never really feel like you're hitting a pose. You're just constantly drifting into that pose. So there's a fine line between easing in and then always drifting towards that extreme and feeling like you're underwater or that your animation is mechanical. So again, this is something that you'll have to learn with experience. So practice. You'll get it. Here in the camera window, I have a simple animation of a ball bouncing and flying around, zigzagging, whoop, what have you. I've used the motion trail feature in Maya to show me the path of the ball through space as well as the spacing of the keys here, indicated by these little crosses, which may be too small to see. If we zoom into this animation here, and I'm looking at the path of action right here, as it comes up right here, I want this to be a nice smooth arc, but you can see this right around here, the path seems to have a little bit of a bump in it, and I just want it to be a nice, smooth, continuing arc up through here. So I'm just going to go to that frame and look at it in the spline editor. And I can see right here that I've got some tangents that are tilted in a funny way, so I'm just going to go ahead and smooth those out. And now you can see that the arc right there is a lot smoother going up into this next action. So, simply smoothing out your tangent handles will help you to have, more often than not, smooth arcs and smooth paths of action. Okay, so here's the example where the curve is going beyond the preceding key. And if I look at the animation at that frame, yeah, let's say I actually like that the path is actually going out that far. I want to keep it there. So just to be on the safe side, I can go to my spline. So I want to add a key here to preserve this extreme, but I want to keep the existing curvature of the spline. So if I just go over here and use the Insert Keys tool, and with that spline selected, I just click on the current frame with the middle mouse button, and poof, it drops in a key right there, and the spline curvature remains intact, as does the curvature of my path of action there, my arc. Very nice. Okay, spline containment in time. Here's a really nasty example I showed before where the spline handle is going beyond the neighboring key. Let's just see what that looks like in the actual animation. Yep, as I suspected, there's a little bit of a cliff right there, a little bit of sharp break in the arc that I don't like right there. So by smoothing out the tangent handle there, I'm guessing it's going to make my arc look better too. So let's just pull this tangent handle back here. I think I better break that. There we go. Pull that back like so. And what do you know? A nice parabolic arc going right off there. So that looks better. Next, we'll talk about variation here. Now, if you look at this section right here, where the ball is sort of zigzagging back and forth in its ascent, let's look at that spline again. That's the X translation that's making it travel left to right. And if I look at the spline in this section, again, you see that the keys are repeating in similar intervals. They're 3 frames apart, and they roughly all go to the same extremes, and the tangent handles are all symmetrical, so the timing is going to be the same in between. And if we actually look at the path of action here, you can see that the keys are roughly grouped the same on all the sides of the extremes of this motion. So you've got these 3 keys right over here, and these right over here. Rather, these 3 frames, I should say. So the path of action is looking very repetitive and symmetrical through there. So by varying up that spline, both in the values of the tangents and the tangent handles, I can break up that motion a little bit to make it more interesting. Let me just go back and do this again. Let's see if I can do some of these splines en masse here. I'm just going to select all these right handles here. I'm going to break the tangents, and then I'll just pull them all out together. So we're going to be easing out of the extremes and then more of a fast in to the next extreme. And then I will just offset some of these values a little bit so they're not quite the same. Maybe I'll make it taper a little bit here. And then, let's see, I'm actually going to pull this one like that so that it actually pulls the extreme slightly onto the half frame right there, just to break up the timing even a little bit more. Let's see how that looks. Okay, now you can see that the shape of the path of action here is not as repetitive and even as it used to be. There's a little bit of breakup of where the extremes occur, and the shape has been broken up a little as well. So that's going to give me a little nicer action through there. And you can also see that the whole shape of the zigzag is sort of tapering towards the top as the values get closer together, just like what I did with the spline right here, how it tapers as it gets further along in time. So again, this is one of those examples where I might tilt the handle so that the curve goes beyond the previous key. In this case, I want to put the extreme on the half frame just because these keys are all pretty close together. They're all on 3s. So if I were to shift the key a whole frame over, that might make the next span of the spline too short. So by just tilting the tangent handle and putting the extreme on the half frame, it still mixes up the timing a little bit without making the change too extreme. So this is an example of where you would employ one of those exceptions to these guidelines. So here's a play blast of the before and after animation where I've applied all my smoothing principles to the animation. The results are somewhat subtle, but it's these subtle kind of details that really distinguish polished animation from not so polished animation, from professional from student. And you notice these things especially on the big screen. So here's before. Here's after. God, that's good animation. All right, now I'm going to take these examples one step further and apply them to actual student work captured in the wild and see how they apply. These spline hygiene principles can be very helpful for diagnosing and solving problems with your spacing and timing, arcs, and whatnot. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit of a play blast from some student animation. Here's the animation. I don't have any sound on here. I'm just going to play this back. And it's not done. The student is in the polish phase, and I'm just trying to help the student to find and fix a few little problems with the timing and the texture of the shot. The first thing I notice right off is there's a pop in the shoulders right there. Pop, pop, popping up. So probably she has an extra key set in there that she didn't know about or didn't mean to set, or the keys are too close together. So let's pop over here into Maya and take a look at that. So right around frame 25, there's that pop in the shoulders. Let me just show the controllers here real quick. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and select the shoulder controls here and take a look at their splines and see what's going on in there. Let's just fit that in there. Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I have my graph editor set up correctly, which I don't really right now. Let's make sure that under View we've set tangents always, very important, so we can always see what the tangents are doing. Right away I can see that there's this sudden dip in all the splines happening on frame 25, and on the previous frame, everything was held up to right there. Now, if I were just to look down here at the timeline, I see, there's two keys that are right next to each other, but, how do I know those keys aren't the same value? How do I know that's the problem? If I go into the spline editor, I see right away there's a really sharp change in these curves. I know there's something wrong there. So there's, different ways I could handle this. Probably the easiest way would just be to select these curves and move them out in time a little bit, and then add a little bit more ease on these guys so that they're not moving so sharply. I'll just take these and break those and pull the handles out to get a little bit more ease. And then it looks like they're doing a little bit of a fast in right over here, which I don't think you want in the shoulders unless the shoulders are colliding with something. So I'm just going to flatten that out a little bit. And I'll break those handles and drag those in a little bit. Actually, I'll drag them out so they ease in, and I'm going to drag these ones in so they fast out a little bit more there. Okay, so let's see how that affects the animation. Okay, it's still a little bit fast. I think they're only 2 frames apart there. I could probably afford to do that a little bit more. 1, 2, 3 frames apart. Okay, let's just move it one more frame out there. Okay, now you can see that those shoulders are a little bit softer. They ease in at the top, and then they drop and ease in at the bottom a little bit. So quick and easy fix just by looking in the spline editor and applying some of those guidelines and spline hygiene rules, making sure that the tangents aren't symmetrical in between the keys, so we've got an ease in over here and a faster out over here. Same thing between these 2 keys. And really just looking at the keys. I mean, sometimes you open the stuff up in a graph editor, and if you haven't looked at it before, you see immediately where the problems are. Again, right here you've got tangent handles that are extending beyond the previous keys in time, so that's probably going to give you some hitching motion in the shoulders right there as well. Let's move on to another section. I want to look at some of the head animation here. Now, if you watch the tip of his nose, I'm just going to scrub through this right here. But he's going to do a head motion where the head comes down, moves the screen right, and then back up slightly. But if you look at the path of action on that nose, you can see it looks like it's very geometrical. So it goes straight down, and then at about, a 60-degree angle right there, and then bounces up at a straight line. So rather than moving in a nice arc, it's kind of going neat, 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 like that. So I have an inkling that just by smoothing out those splines in there, that we might be able to smooth out that arc as well. Let's take a look-see. Here are the rotations that affect that head arc. And there's a couple problems I see right off the bat. One, we've got this keyframe right here where it's doing a real fast in, so I know that the motion is going to come to a sudden stop right there. So simply by making this a flat tangent and letting that ease in a little bit more, that's going to help that. Next, we've got a little bit of weirdness with the spline here. We've got a curve containment problem right here. You can see that this tangent is overshooting the previous key, so I'm just going to break that really quickly and drag it back, and then smooth this one out just a little bit. So we get a nice flow through that spline there, like so. There we go. Well, let's just take a look at it and see if that did it. Not quite yet. Is there another control on there? Oh, the head. Duh! Ah, here we go. Okay, so I thought the problem was in the neck. It's actually in the head. Just it goes to show that when you're in another animator's shot, you're not necessarily sure where the keys are, and when you're animating your own shot, you really want to be aware of where those keys are, and you really need to go in and look at all of them, usually starting from the root and smoothing your way out, because I could go in and smooth the head splines, but if my neck and chest and root splines are still rough, that's all going to trickle down to the head and make my animation look wonky. So let's assume that I've gone in and smoothed the root, worked my way up the spine, through the neck, and now I'm looking at the head to diagnose this problem with the arcs. Aha! Look at this. Oh boy. Let's just zoom in on this, see if you can see this. Yeah, we've got some fast ins right here where the head is going to hit this key pretty suddenly. You've got an unsmooth spline right here. Again, some fast outs right here. Probably not what she wanted. We even got a doubled up key right here, which means the head is going to be exactly the same on those two frames. Boy, I can't wait to go in here and smooth these. Okay, let's go. I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to get rid of this tangent handle overshoot right here, and I'm going to go ahead and smooth this one out right here, and let's just widen this one out a little bit right there so that it doesn't hit so hard. Like that. Let's smooth that one out a little bit right there. Let's get in a little bit closer here. Okay, this one right here is kind of doing a fast out. I don't think that's what we want there, so let's just go ahead and smooth that. Keep the curve contained. Oh, this one needs a little bit smoothing too. You can see that it kind of comes to a flat right there instead of flowing through the spline. Whoop, didn't mean to select two. Oh, things are going fast and furious now. There we go. Nice movement through the spline there. And boy, I could keep going on this for a while, but I won't. Let's stop and see if that fixed the problem that I was talking about.
Animation Mentor.
So here's the play blast of the file that I just did a little bit of smoothing on. I'll first play it here in real time. And let me just scrub through here so we can see that these shoulders no longer pop up there. They kind of do a nice rise up and ease in and then settle back down. And if you watch the arc on his nose here as it comes down around here, it looks a little nicer. Still could use a little more refinement in there, but that's probably more for my polish pass. This just goes to show that by going in and just looking at your splines and applying some of these hygiene principles to them, you can get your animation a lot closer to the polish phase than if you hadn't. Next, I'm going to discuss some tips and tricks that you can use in your graph editor, little shortcuts that you can take to make your workflow faster and animation just a little easier. The first tip is what I call easy eases. We're often adding eases, ease-ins, and ease-outs to our animation, but you don't always necessarily need to have a second key in order to define the shape of that curve for the ease. So it can just be simple as selecting a tangent, breaking it, and then pulling it out a little bit longer on one side, maybe making it a little bit shorter on one side, and already now the motion is favoring the second key. I do this kind of thing a lot when I'm animating fingers or facial controls where I've got a lot of controls moving and I really don't want to have to go in and add a whole bunch of extra keys. This is just a quick and easy way to add an ease in, and it's good to do when you're sure that your timing's not going to change a whole lot and mess up what your tangents have done here. So just a quick little shortcut for that. And really, anytime I go into my spline editor, I'm always looking for timing in the splines that is symmetrical. So like say right here, I've got the same tangents on both sides. And just simply going into all those places and pulling one tangent out longer than the other is just a quick and easy way to vary the timing so you know that timing is not going to be symmetrical in between those two keys. That really, you get a lot of mileage out of that technique. And you're not limited to just doing it to one key at a time. You can select a whole bunch of keys at the same time and do that same thing. So for instance, right here, I've got these keys are all flat tangents. They're all symmetrical in timing. So for example, I can just select all these tangents on this side, break them, and drag them out longer to get more of an ease in. Then select the opposing tangent handles. I'll break those and drag those in a little bit like that. Right away, with just a few mouse clicks and drags, I've varied the timing on these keys so that the timing between them is not linear and even. Again, a real great shortcut when you're dealing with lots of controls, like say in fingers or eyebrows and stuff like that, that doesn't need to have a lot of extra keys added to it to get the quality of motion that you're after. Next, I'm going to talk about easy overlap, where you can take the keys and tangents from one control, copy them into another control, and adjust them, offset them in time so that you get a nice successive breaking of joints. Quick and easy. So let's take, for example, this wonderful animation of Taylor bouncing across the screen. And as you can see, the ball part's doing nice arcs. It's got pretty decent timing on it, but the tail is stuck out there as if it's got rigor mortis. So here's a little tip for adding some overlapping action, and this mostly applies to things like tails or hair or pieces of cloth that you have to animate that aren't necessarily alive, but still require some sort of looseness and flexibility to make them feel like they have weight. So here I have the Y-Translate spline from the ball section. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to select the X rotation for the first segment of the tail, go to frame 1, and I'm going to paste it, like so. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the other segments of the tail. Let's just select all the segments of the tail here, and bring that up here. So I'll just go to the second segment of the tail and paste it there. Third segment, paste it there. Fourth segment, paste it there. So let's look at all the X rotates here, and they all look the same. They all have the same values here. So basically, that is my Y-Translate copied into the segments of the tail, the X rotate. But if we play back the animation here, you're really not going to notice a whole lot going on the tail. In fact, it's almost imperceptible. Why? Well, because the value range of the Y-Translate was only, let's see, from 0 to about 0.8. So there's only about a 0.8 difference between the upper and lower extremes of the translate animation, which is fine for translate, but the tail is all rotation-based, so you don't really notice a 0.8 degree rotation. So what we need to do is take all these splines and scale them up to the appropriate range. So what I will do is load all those tail channels into the graph editor, select all the rotates. There we go. And I'm going to find the uppermost extreme, which is right here on frame 11. And I am going to move all the splines up in value until I like the way that that rotation looks in the camera. So I've got all those selected, go to my move tool, and I'm just going to move those up. You can see the whole tail is moving now because I'm moving the keys from all the different segments at the same time. Just move that up some more. And maybe just a little bit more. I'll just take it a little bit extreme for now. Okay, let's say about that much. So that's the most I want the tail to be bent. And now let's go ahead and set the lower extreme by scaling the entire spline downward now from that upper extreme. I still want to preserve the relative differences between all the keys. So rather than just grabbing the lower extremes and moving those all down in unison, I'm actually going to scale the entire spline so that the shape is preserved, but it just spans a greater range of values. So let's go to a key where there's a downward extreme. That would be, well, 16 looks as good as any. So the ball's all the way down. Let's move the tail into a downward extreme using the scale tool. Scale tool, okay. I'm going to scale away from the upper extreme here. So just click there and we'll scale down. You can see the whole tail is starting to reverse direction there. Zoom in there. Let's scale down some more from that upper extreme. Okay, that tail's reversing direction. And let's say that's my downward extreme. I think that looks about right. Yeah, okay. So let's see what that animation looks like. I can pretty much tell you it's not going to look good. You see like that? So the tail is bending, but it doesn't read as overlapping action right now. That's because all the extremes are happening on the same frame, so there's no successive breaking of joints. What we want to do now, and this is where the magic happens, is offset all those keys in the tail so they occur later in time, and that way we get that wave-like action through the tail. So let's go back in here to the spline editor, and I'm going to look at the channel for the first tail joint right here, and I'm just going to select all these splines, and with the move tool I'm just going to delay them one frame in time. Let's look at the second joint, select all these, I'm going to move them 2 frames in time. Select the third joint. Select all these. Delay them in time. 1, 2, 3. And the fourth joint. Select all those. Delay them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's look at all those together. And we should have nice cascading looking splines there. And let's see how it looks in the animation window. Look at that. It kind of works. Now, it's not perfect, but, you know, that gets you like 70% of the way there, and you can go in and add any extra breakdowns you want, or adjust the range of the rotations if you think that's too extreme or not extreme enough. But that's a really quick and easy way to take the data from one channel, propagate it through a bunch of channels, and get some easy overlap. It also works for getting squash and stretch. You can take the Y translation of the hips and copy it into the squash and stretch channel for the torso. You can use it for head overlap by copying the Y translation for the torso into the head X rotate, offsetting that in time. There's 1,000,001 ways to apply this to get easy overlap. I use this trick a lot, and it's really handy. And I'll go ahead and make a play blast of this right now just so we can see what it looks like. Here we go, playing it back. So, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty darn good start. You can see right at the beginning here, there's not much going on in the tail. That's because all those keys got offset, so there's no data going on there in the tail. You would have to fill some of that in yourself. And there's places where it probably goes too far, like right here. I think the tip of that tail is probably animating too far, but it's all easy to adjust. Better than starting with nothing. Just as we can copy and paste splines between different channels on the same object or different joints on the same object, we can also copy-paste splines from one channel to another channel on the same joint to give a little more interest to the motion. Often I find that when you move a joint in one axis only, it's not as interesting as it could be if you add a little extra axis animation in there. So for example, I'm going to take a simple head tilt animation here. Let's go ahead and play this. This is just a looping animation, nothing special. Just left and right in the head and neck. And I'm just going to take that, the Z rotation in Z that we can see here. And I'm just going to take that and I'm going to copy it into the Y rotation of the head, which is the twisting action, offset them in time, and see what we get. So you can see here that I've taken the rotate Z spline and copied it into the Y rotation spline and moved it, a few frames ahead in time. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames ahead in time. And the result I get here I like to call the Stevie Wonder effect, because you can see now that the twist of the head is actually leading the side-to-side tilt of the head. So it breaks up the motion so it's not so one-dimensional, I guess. The rotation's happening on 2 axes at once, but they aren't reaching their extremes at the same time. I can take that Y rotation spline and offset it in the other direction, and it would give me a completely different result. This one makes it drag more, as like he's bopping his head to music or something like that. You can see that the top of the head now leads the rotation, and then the twist follows behind. I could also invert the Y rotation spline so that it hits opposite values. There's a lot of different ways you can play with that same spline and vary the results depending on what you want. So this is something that I'll usually do in my polish pass, just to keep a joint movement from looking too mechanical, give it a little bit more interest, a little bit more life. At Pixar, we refer to this technique as the McQueen technique, after the late great Pixar animator Glenn McQueen. That man could animate an entire shot with a single spline. For the last part of this lecture, I am going to discuss my spline-based workflow. This is for getting your animation from stepped curves into splines without too much pain. This is not going to be a full-blown workflow demo. I'm not going to talk about planning or about final polish and all that stuff. This is really more the tricky second act of going from blocking into your first rough pass of animation. It can be really hard, really scary to convert all your step curves into splines and watch your timing fall apart and watch your animation go out of control. So hopefully these techniques that I'll show you here will make it easier for you to make that transition from stepped into splines. So first I'm just going to start off with a simple animation that I've blocked here of Stewie jumping. This is all on stepped curves, and I've gone ahead and used the arc tracking tool to show you the basic arcs of the feet, the root, and the head, or the neck if you prefer. So it's all broken down and keyed on about at least 4. I think there's a key at least every 4 frames, which for a short animation or a very physical animation I try to do just to make sure that there's enough information there to roughly define my arcs and eases right in the blocking phase. So you can see right here there's a little bit of an ease into this anticipation right there, and you can actually see that in the motion paths right here. You can see that these two poses easing into each other. But then there's other places like right here where there's no ease in, there's no overlap, and in the stand there's no ease in there. So there's not all the information here that I want. And a lot of that information I can get just by going in and smoothing out the splines and applying the techniques that I've discussed in this course and in my previous spline lecture. Now, when I'm blocking, I make sure to key every control in the character on the same frame so that I know that all these poses are protected. So if I add a key later on, it's not going to affect a pose that occurred before or after that in time. And let me just take a look at the root con spline here in the graph editor. Let's just look at the X and Y translates. Or is it the Y and Z? Y and Z translates. Okay, he's moving in the YZ plane. So if you use your imagination and you ignore these steps here, if you look at the keys, you can see the path that they describe there. So they're already relatively smooth as they move through time and space. And you can see right here is that first ease in I was talking about right there. So if you use your imagination to fill in a spline right there, you can see it's kind of going to ease in right there. Same thing there because this key is pretty close to this key in value. Same thing right here. But then later on in time, there's not so much easing going on here. You can see there's a hold right here and then step to another hold right here. So you see that could definitely use some spline smoothing love. Let's say you're happy with this blocking, you're ready to move on. You might make the mistake of just saying, well, I'm ready to go into splines now, so I'm just going to select all of his controls and convert them into splines, and we'll just see what happens, right? Okay, so here are all his controls that I've keyed, and I'm just going to select these all and convert them to splines. Voila. And you can see right away that there's going to be some problems here. There's some bad hygiene. You've got issues of curve containment right here where the curves are shooting well beyond the keys and in between. You know, it's kind of ruined this ease in right here because you've got more of an S shape now than an ease in. Something lumpy right there. It's kind of an M shape. I don't know what's going to happen there. And then again, you've got some unwanted overshoot in this section right here with these splines overshooting the keys. So that's generally very naughty. Let's take a look at how that looks when we play back the animation. All right, so here we go. Here is the animation. If I just took all the step curves and converted them wholesale into splines, you get something like this. So there are some areas of nice smooth motion. You can see the arcs look pretty good there, but you can see there's also lots of messy areas. For example, the feet are overshooting their goals. Here you can see right down here the feet actually go below the ground in an unwanted way, and they're wiggling around in there. You can see there's some slippage in the feet at the end there. You can see there's some weird clumping of spacing right here and here. It's wiggling around in that anticipation instead of just being a simple ease in. So there's a lot of unwanted artifacts in this animation. Even though I keyed the thing on force to keep it controlled, the splines are still trying to wreak havoc with my timing and my spacing and my paths of action. So a better way to do things would be to load up all his controls, and instead of just going right into spline tangents, I select them all and I convert them to flat tangents. This guarantees that none of the splines will go beyond the extents of the keys, and while it might not make for as nice arcs and spacing right off the bat, it will keep my animation within the realm of values that I've set, and it'll keep the timing closer to how I blocked it. Just to back up a little bit talking about the splines. Even if you use the copied pairs method of blocking, where you double up all your poses so you have holds when you go into splines, you can still get the artifact of unwanted overshoots in your splines when you go into spline mode. So it's best to convert to flat tangents when coming out of stepped curves. Some people like to convert to clamp splines instead of flat tangents. I personally don't like clamp splines because I find that they move in unpredictable ways or they seem to have a mind of their own. So I generally tend to avoid clamp splines and work with the regular generic splines or with flat tangents because I know they're only going to move when I move them. So let's take a look at what it looks like when we convert all our splines from stepped to flat tangents. Here is the animation all converted to flat tangents, and you can see that in the arc tracker tool here that the spacing and the arcs aren't as nice, particularly in this foot here. It's triangular instead of arcing. This arc has more of a peak on it, and the spacing isn't great. You've got a little bit of gathering of the frames in here, but you'll also notice that there are no overshoots anywhere. This ease in is still an ease in right here. It's very simple. The feet do not go below the plane of the ground. They don't slide around when they're planted on the ground until I want them to. So this is a nice controlled place to jump off from and start smoothing my splines to get the performance that I want. All right, so let's take some of the smoothing principles that I used in my first spline lecture and in the spline hygiene section from this lecture and start applying them to the animation of Stewie jumping. And I'm going to start with the root first because that's a very good place to start, and then I will work my way up the chain of the body and into the head. All right, let's start with just the translates. And he's really only moving in Y and Z axes at this point, so that's all I'm really going to focus on at this point. Let's make sure I'm seeing my tangents here. View tangents always. Aha. Okay, just by simply opening up the root controller here in the graph editor, I can see on the Z translate spline right here that we've got a lot of flat tangents that we don't need. So to make that spline smoother, it's just as simple as selecting those and converting those to regular splines. And now we have a nice flow through those keys up into the hold. Let's zoom in a little closer here to the first action, the ease into that anticipation pose where Stewie is crouching. I can go ahead and smooth these out and get this easing in right here. I want to make sure not to overshoot the second key here. I want to contain that curve. Same thing here. We'll tilt it just enough to keep it easing in, but I don't want the handle to go above the next key, like so. I can smooth that one out. Oops, that's dropping a little too low there. I'll pull that back. Okay. Here's another easy smoothing situation right there. Here's a section right here where we're going into a hold, and it's looking perfectly flat there, so I'd rather keep that alive a little bit by just dropping and tilting the spline a little right here. Let's see what the Z translate is doing all the way up here. Okay, that's holding as well, so I'm just going to give that a little bit more ease right there. Like so. Just a hair more. Let's see how that looks. So we're just looking at the root here. So I can see now that the root does a little ease in right down here as it hits this stopping point here. Instead of just hitting and stopping, it keeps easing in a little bit right there. It's subtle, but it's nice for keeping it alive and giving it a sense of weight. And then I can just keep applying these same principles to the rest of the spline until I'm all done with the root. Now there's one thing that I want to get in this animation that's not in there yet. It's not in the keys, but I want to have it in there. And that's a little bit of overshoot in the hips when he turns to look back right here. I'd actually like to have the hips come forward a little more and then settle back right there. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit of overshoot in those hips right there around frame 49. And this harkens back to the overshooting techniques I talked about in the first section of my lecture. Let's just look at the, what is that, the Z translate? Yeah, that's the Z translate. Z translation here. Okay, so you can see right here Rather than easing in, that Z translate comes forward and then it just stops dead right there on frame 48. So I'm just going to continue that spline upward a little bit like so to let him overshoot that pose and then come back to settle. Let's see how that looks right there. Might need a little bit more. No, that's pretty good. So you can see the hips continue to travel forward a little bit there and then settle back. Might even let that settle back, ease in a little bit more, just so it doesn't hit too hard. So I'll just ease that in a tad right there. Keep those pixels alive, like so. Let's just zoom in on this, see what it looks like. There we go. So it's overshooting and then easing back to a rest pose there. So I'm just going to continue with both the translate and rotate channels on the root con and continue to put eases in where they are not, or push the eases further that I need to push, add overshoots wherever I need to, just to get all the extra texture that I want in the root con before I move on to the other parts of the body. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so here we have the smoothed out root animation of Stewie, and I'm just showing you the arcs for the root since that's what I've been working on. So just by looking at this path right here, you can see it's got a nice ease into the bottom here, then acceleration, nice arc over the top, and then deceleration into the bottom here. And then as I was working on before, you can see when he stands up and leans back, you've got overshoot and settle backward in the hips. So I like how these hips are going, so I'm just going to work my way up the spine and apply the same principles and keep smoothing him until I get to the head. Next, I'm going to select all three controls for the spine and load those into the graph editor, and I'm going to look at the X rotations for all of those because that's where most of the animation is happening. I generally like to work with the spine as one shape, so I tend to key and smooth all three of those channels together at the same time. So you can see here all three of the spline channels are pretty much in sync with each other, except for right around here on frame 29 or so they diverge. That's probably because I have a breakdown there. Let's take a look at that. Yeah, here's where I have a little bit of an S shape in the spine as he's going from the reverse bend into the forward bend. I'm dragging the chest, so that's why the spine is starting to separate and get into a more complex shape there, as is demonstrated in the splines here. But for the rest of it, I've pretty much treated the spline as one simple curve and keyed it all together. So now it's time to just go in and start smoothing away. Looking for nice smooth splines. Also wanting to contain my curves so that they don't overshoot the keys like we just got right here. Let's just pull that back a little bit so it doesn't overshoot. There we go. Can smooth that one out right there. And we'll give this one a little bit of an ease here, like so. Again, here's a good place for an ease. Let's take a look at that part of the animation. Do I want to ease that or do I want to overshoot that? That's where he's standing up. I'd like to ease that in because the hips are still coming up. So let's just go ahead and ease that in, like so, a little bit more. Okay. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like when I've done my smoothing pass on the spine. Here we go, and I've plotted out the arcs on the neck area as well, so you can see the path of action that's being described by the top of the torso. So we've got some nice arcs here, nice eases in, and it's feeling a lot looser than it did in the blocking and in the conversion into flat tangents here. So from here, I'll just move up into the neck and the head, apply the same principles there. It's a very systematic, procedural way of working. I'll do the same thing for the feet. And when I'm all done with my first smoothing pass on all the splines, it'll look something like this. So you can see it's nice and smooth. You know, it's got all the eases and the overshoots that I want. It's far from done. There are still plenty of things to work on. I think his left leg looks a little bit floaty through the jump here. There's no real lead and follow with the head. I want the head to lead into the anticipation more. There's a little bit of popping in the knees in places. So it's not perfect yet, But without adding a single extra keyframe, I've got nice, smooth animation with eases and overshoots that hasn't compromised my original blocking. It's got basically nice timing, and it's also very organized. All the keys are set on the same frames, so it's easy to make edits, to scale timing, to shorten it, to lengthen it, to add more information in between or further breakdowns. From here, I can go on and offset keys or add in extra keys to further shape my arcs and refine the performance. This is a good way to head into your polish phase and really start tying down this animation. So that's it, really. That's all I know to tell you about splines. Hopefully the topics I've covered today, the spline hygiene, the tips and tricks, the spline-based workflow, will allow you to focus more on the performance side of the animation rather than on the technical side of the animation. Keep practicing these tips I've showed you today, and they'll become second nature to you. And then you too can become a splinophile.